Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, has been wrongly interpreted by history as being some sort of staunch defender of slavery and Southern reactionary thought. The historical fact is that Davis's actions during the American Civil War aligned him not with conservatism, but with the progressive political principles of his time. Principles that included public oversight over essential industries and a measured, gradualist approach to emancipation. As I will demonstrate, Jefferson Davis wasn't only open to the idea of ending slavery, but also spearheaded what may be considered as the first instance of war socialism in human history. Born on June 3rd of 1808 in the state of Kentucky, Jefferson Davis's early environment was very different from that of most of his Confederate contemporaries. His father, Samuel Emory Davis, and his older brother, Joseph Emory Davis, were established in the plantation economy, yet young Davis was raised on the frontier region where slavery hadn't yet entrenched itself as deeply as in older southern states. As a young officer in the U.S. Army, Jefferson Davis earned high regards from the Native Americans, even being adopted into one tribe and given the nickname the Little Chief, as Davis not only respected but was respected by the indigenous people from his earliest years. One of the most telling and interesting relationships in Davis's youth was with a man named James Pemberton, a slave who had been given to Davis as a body servant. Pemberton remained fiercely loyal to Davis, nursing him through illnesses and later managing Davis's plantation himself. The dynamic between these two paints for us a picture of a relationship based upon mutual respect, as pointed out by scholar Walter L. Fleming from Johns Hopkins University Press, who noted that Davis and his manager treated one another as gentlemen. After leaving the military, Davis founded the Breerfield Cotton Plant. In a radical departure from era-typical Southern practices, Davis allowed self-governance among the chattel slaves who worked his plantation, thereby implementing a system where his slaves managed their own affairs and even established a self-governing court system. On this plant, no slave was ever punished except after conviction by a jury of their own fellow black peers. Davis's system of self-governance was so unusual that Union officers mistook his plantation for a Freedmen's Bureau experiment. Davis wasn't some sort of mindless defender of slavery, and he was clearly open to alternative approaches to solving race relations. Furthermore, Davis, unlike his Southern contemporaries, believed in treating blacks with equal dignity and respect, refusing to use derogatory names for slaves as most planters did, instead referring to them in all cases by their full names. When asked why he did this by Mrs. Davis, who noted that he would return the bows given to him by his slaves, Davis said, "I cannot allow any Negro to outdo me in courtesy." These practices represented, within the context of Southern culture, an early form of enlightened labor management in what was a deeply divided society. During his tenure as U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, it is true that Davis defended the right to transport slaves into new territories. However, this was only because, as Davis himself expresses, he simultaneously believed that slavery was a mutable institution. In 1860, Davis argued that the personal relationship between the slave and the master could foster in small plantation settings kindness and nobility of soul, expanding upon this point, stating that large-scale plantations enabled dehumanization, which only arose when slaves were treated as impersonal property. Thereby, his argument concluded that in smaller, more intimate household settings, the institution of slavery would gradually evolve toward eventual emancipation. In other words, Davis was implicating the theory that economic and social evolution would lead to a natural phasing out of slavery. Unlike most of the planter class as a whole, Davis openly opposed the mistreatment of freed blacks. On one occasion, he visited a northern reformatory where a young black boy had begged him for help. Noting down privately to himself, "I tried to procure the little fellow's liberty and offered to take him and guarantee his freedom, but he was in a free state, and I could not get him. It was bad enough to keep white children there, but it was inhuman to incarcerate that irresponsible Negro child." When discussing Davis and the Confederacy, one of course has to confront the oversimplified and revisionist narrative that the Civil War was fought solely to preserve slavery. The economic grievances and complaints of federal overreach were not merely peripheral issues for the Southerners. First, consider the impact of the Morrill Tariff. Although this tariff was only enacted on March 2nd of 1861 after the start of the Civil War, it had been introduced long before during the 35th Congress of 1857 to 1859. The tariff was a direct economic assault on the South's export-based economy and forced Southern states to choose between economic devastation and political self-determination. The tariff increased the effective rate on dutiable imports by about 70%, raising the average American tariff rates to about 26% overall, 36% on dutiable items. Only 4 states issued ordinances of secession explicitly citing slavery as a motive. In contrast, 9 states did not, and slave states such as Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and New Jersey chose to remain in the Union. Even within the Union, legal protections like the Corbin Amendment upheld the institution of slavery, and the Emancipation Proclamation applied only to the Southern slave states, not Northern slave states. Southern grievances were further compounded by an unequal fiscal system. Despite paying 85% of federal taxes, Southerners saw 75% of that revenue funneled to the North. This economic imbalance, coupled with the destabilizing influence of Northern backed agitators such as John Brown, who murdered, looted, and burned down Southern towns, created an environment where political self determination was not a luxury but a necessity, not just for planters, but for average, everyday Southern producers and consumers. Moreover, the timing of this secession of Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina speaks volumes to the facts. These states delayed secession until after President Lincoln had called for troop mobilizations to invade the South, which clearly proves that their secession was motivated not by slavery, but by what was perceived as an existential threat to their existence, not some inflexible commitment to the institution of slavery. Finally, consider the demographic landscape. At the war's outset, with the Union comprised of more slave states than the Confederacy. The Union had Missouri, it had Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, all slave states, versus the Confederacy, which had only 7 slave states. Entirely breaking from the long held norms of the South, Davis began to advocate for the enlistment of black men, not merely as laborers but as active participants in the war effort in 1863. By August of 1863, Davis announced plans to enlist black slaves, and by early 1864, proposals were underway that tied emancipation directly to military service, instigated by Confederate Major General Patrick R. Cleburne. The underlying logic was clear to everybody at the time. At this point, if slaves were to be freed, it was to be done in a way that directly contributed to the defense and eventual survival of the state. This policy was unprecedented in Southern history. Davis was willing to completely do away with a principle that had long defined the Southern way of life in the name of independence. By doing so, any notion that the Confederacy was fighting simply to preserve slavery was done away with, and it was made clear that the primary goal of the Confederacy was independence at any cost. Understandably, when Jefferson Davis first presented Cleburne's proposals to his cabinet, it was shot down with much objection from the Confederate government and traditional politicians who viewed this as a betrayal, and so the idea was forced into secrecy to avoid public uproar. However, later, by November of 1864, when the war had become more dire, Davis moved to support Major General Cleburne's proposal openly, knowing it would be more acceptable for public opinion at that point as the war had become more and more steeped in Confederate blood. It was Davis who had stated to James R. Gilmore, quote, "We are not fighting for slavery, we are fighting for independence, and that or extermination we will have," in 1864, after slamming his fist down on his desk in a heated discussion with the fellow. Davis himself pointed out on November 7th of 1864 that a radical modification in the theory of law had become necessary to address the Confederacy's manpower shortages, later stating, quote, "Should the alternative ever be presented of subjugation or of the employment of the slave as a soldier, there seems no reason to doubt what should then be our decision, then implying eventual emancipation." Davis sent Duncan F. Kenner to Britain and France in December of 1864 in a desperate bid to secure diplomatic recognition for the Confederacy, offering gradual universal emancipation as a bargaining chip to those nations, which demonstrated that Jefferson was overtly more than willing to sacrifice slavery for the greater goal of Southern independence. In the Confederate law authorizing the enlistment of black soldiers, the Confederate government moved to begin the enlistment of 10% of the Confederate slave population into the armed forces. Jefferson Davis interceded in this law through Military Order 14 on March 23rd of 1865, in which Davis overrode legislative authority and mandated an executive order initiating the process of Confederate emancipation. Although some academics have argued that Order 14 didn't guarantee emancipation for veteran slaves, the facts are quite different. The initial Confederate law authorizing the enlistment of black soldiers did have no provisions for Southern emancipation to any extent initially. However, at Davis's personal command, emancipation orders began to take place. Although Order 14 appears to leave emancipation in the hands of the slave's master, the language of the military order was intended to create a legal pathway to emancipation. Consider the requirement, for example, that no slave be accepted as a recruit, quote, "unless with his own consent and with the approbation of his master by a written instrument conferring, as far as he may, the rights of a freed man." Through this text, it was guaranteed that freedmen rights were to be granted to the individual, completely altering his legal status upon execution and filing. Davis's executive intercession further stipulated that as a condition of enlistment, these individuals would receive the same rations, the same clothing, and the same compensation as white Confederate soldiers, a provision not even accounted for in the northern enlistment of black soldiers who were paid considerably less than white soldiers under the command of Lincoln. Under military law, these benefits were inherently granted to free Confederate citizens, which meant that the former slaves were then equals among Confederate troops. The order also made a requirement for the superintendent to file and record the individual's transition from slave to freedman. Although Section 5 states that nothing in the Act shall change the slave's relation to his owner without consent and state law, the operative clause conferring the rights of a freedman legally mandates that the individual be treated as a free man. This duality here is resolved by the fact that the military rights conferred are exclusively those of a free person, which leaves no room for ambiguity regarding his status. By conditioning enlistment on the execution of a legally binding instrument that transfers freedman rights to said former slave, the act didn't merely suggest or imply freedom, it required that those rights be conferred absolutely. Although it would only be a short time before the fall of the Confederacy, by the time that this military order was enacted, hundreds of Afro Confederates would be enlisted, with many seeing combat during their time in service. Confederate courier R.M. Doswell recounts, quote, I saw a wagon train guarded by Confederate Negro soldiers. When within about 100 yards of and in the rear of the wagon train, I observed some Union cavalry a short distance away on elevated ground forming to charge and the Negro soldiers forming to meet the attack, which was met successfully. The cavalry charged again, and the Negro troops surrendered. All in all, the Union counted 320 white and 310 black prisoners in that encounter alone. Beyond matters of race and emancipation, which I've thoroughly made my point on, Davis's leadership extended into economic policy. What did the government do within the Confederacy in matters that meant anything for the average Confederate citizen? As the Confederacy struggled to sustain its war effort, Davis presided over an economy that increasingly abandoned laissez faire capitalist principles in favor of centralized governance. The Confederacy didn't merely regulate industries as a standard interventionist capitalist nation would do during wartime, it outright nationalized key economic sectors, banking, powder mills, ironworks, and shipyards. All of these became state owned, while the government became the regulator of production and distribution of goods and services. By 1863, Davis implemented sweeping governmental reform and control over transportation, nationalizing railroads and telegraph lines, dictating prices and profits for companies supplying the armed forces. By the end of the American Civil War, the Confederate government had attained 70,000 employees, rivaling some of the largest centralized states around the world at the time. Confederate Chief of Ordnance Josiah Gorgas created state owned cannon foundries and small arms factories, boasting, quote, where 3 years ago we were not making a gun, pistol, nor a saber, we now make all these in quantities to meet the demand of our large armies. Even quotas for production in both agriculture and manufacturing were introduced, while farmers were required to pay taxes not in money but in actual goods, meaning the state directly controlled agricultural output, particularly cotton agricultural output, which it stockpiled in hopes for trade with Europe. Of note was the fact that Davis instituted the first conscription in American history, and in 1864 had recommended a 5% tax on land and slaves. All of these policies made Davis extremely unpopular among slave plantation owners, libertarians, and some state governors who saw Davis as recreating the exact same system that they had been intending to secede from. The method of management utilized by the Confederacy would heavily inspire the economic strategies employed by Woodrow Wilson during World War I, where industries were placed under federal supervision to maximize wartime production. Davis's limits on cotton and tobacco production, while having the government purchase excess crops to redistribute, also certainly mirrored and perhaps inspired later New Deal policies, which would be instituted by FDR during the first half of the 1930s. After the Confederacy's defeat, Davis was imprisoned at Fortress Monroe, where he spent years reflecting on the future of the dreams of African Americans. In his memoirs, he said of the African Americans, I liked them and am gratified by their friendly remembrance, further adding yet another riveting statement expressing that whatever may be the result of the present experiment, referring to emancipation universally, the former relation of the races was one which could incite to harshness only a very brutal nature. This quote shows for a fact that Davis at least believed that the pre war racial hierarchy was entirely enforced with unnecessary cruelty, and at most placed some hope in the trajectory of the current system of the time. In other words, it can be said with complete certainty that Davis hoped to see a non coercive system at play in mediating race relations. Numerous free African Americans attended his funeral. One letter from former slaves who had been under Davis's wing to Davis's family stated, "We, the old servants and tenants of our beloved master, Honorable Jefferson Davis, have caused to mingle our tears over his death, who was always so kind and thoughtful of our peace and happiness. We extend to you our humble sympathy." Jefferson Davis, who is almost always depicted as a reactionary and a sinister thinker, was in fact rather progressive and forward thinking during his time, opposing laissez faire capitalism and pursuing a publicly managed economy. His approach to emancipation, without a doubt, positioned him as an excellent leader willing to adapt to the rapidly shifting world around him, even throughout much resistance from the reactionary planter class of his time. His legacy is that of a great man blighted by history and placed in nothing but the most unfortunate circumstances. By the end of the war, the Confederacy had abandoned free market capitalism in favor of a socialized economy that would later directly influence American federal governance during the World Wars, as well as the Populist Party, Socialist Greenback Party, and Socialist Party, all of which were chock full of former Confederate soldiers. The Populist Party, for example, placed former Confederate Major James G. Field as their vice presidential candidate. Barzillai J. Chambers, another Confederate veteran and lawyer, was a member of both the Greenback and Populist parties. Marcus Pomeroy, infamous for his anti-Lincoln sentiment during the American Civil War, would also become a member of the Greenback Party and later form the Union Greenback Labor Party. Jefferson Davis's legacy, then, isn't that of a backward-looking traditionalist clinging to an old order, but of an unintentional progressive pioneer of self-determination and state-driven economic policy maligned by unfortunate circumstances. Retrospecting on the events of the American Civil War, in 1881 Jefferson Davis stated, "'Tis been said that I should apply to the United States for a pardon, but repentance must precede the right of a pardon, and I have not repented. Remembering as I must all which has been suffered, all which has been lost, disappointed hopes, and crushed aspirations. Yet I deliberately say, if it were to do over again, I would again do just as I did in 1861.
300,000 Yankees is stiff in southern dust. We got 300,000 before they conquered us. They died of southern fever and southern steel and shot. I wish they were 3 million instead of what we got. I can't take up my musket and fight 'em now no more. But I ain't gonna love 'em, now that is certain sure. And I don't want no pardon for what I was and am. I won't be reconstructed and I do not give a damn. Oh, I'm a good old rebel, now that's just what I am. For this Yankee nation I do not give a damn. I'm glad I fought again her, I only wish we'd won. I ain't asked any pardon for anything I've done. I ain't asked any pardon for anything I've done.